Radius is the lateral bone of forearm. It is narrow above at the elbow joint and wider below at the wrist joint. It takes part in the formation of elbow joint above, synovial joint of hinge variety, wrist joint by its lower end, which is a synovial joint of ellipsoid variety, superior and inferior radio-ulnar joint, these are synovial joints of pivot variety, and middle radio-ulnar joint, the syndesmosis. The interosseous membrane joins the two bones. It keeps them at proper distance, helps in transmitting weight, and increases surface area for attachment of muscles. The middle radio-ulnar joint is the syndesmosis united by the interosseous membrane. It joins the two bones, keeps them at proper distance, helps in transmitting weight, and increases surface area for attachment. Upper end, which comprises of disc-shaped head, narrow neck, radial tuberosity below the medial part of neck, shaft with concave anterior surface, rounded lateral surface with a rough ridge in its middle and a posterior surface. Borders are sharp interosseous border, oblique anterior border, and poorly defined posterior border. Lower end is broad and flat. Its lateral end projects downwards as the styloid process. On its dorsal surface is a tubercle, the dorsal tubercle of radius, with a groove on its medial side for the passage of extensor pollicis longus tendon. Side identification. Narrow flat end is the upper end. Concave anterior surface is anteriorly. Sharp interosseous border is medial. Dorsal tubercle on the dorsal aspect of lower end, and styloid process on the lateral side of lower end. Rough area on the lateral surface gives attachment to pronator teres for pronation. It helps in picking up food from the plate. Lateral surface of upper 1/3, including part of posterior and anterior surfaces, gives insertion to important supinator muscle. It supinates the forearm and puts the food into the mouth. Anterior oblique line gives part of origin to flexor digitorum superficialis muscle. Concave anterior surface in upper 3/4 part gives origin to flexor pollicis longus, and lower 1/4 gives insertion to pronator quadratus muscle. On the styloid process is the insertion of brachioradialis. This muscle arises from the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus. Both pronators, that is pronator teres and pronator quadratus, both supinators, that is biceps brachii and supinator, and brachioradialis get inserted into the lateral bone of the forearm, that is the radius. On the anterior surface at its lower end lies the important radial pulse before it disappears into anatomical snuff box. Posterior surface gives attachment to deep extensors of wrist joint. Lower end provides 4 compartments for passage of tendons and other structures. First compartment shows tendons of abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis. Second compartment has 2 wrist extensors, extensor carpi radialis longus and extensor carpi radialis brevis. Third compartment contains only 1 tendon, the extensor pollicis longus. Fourth compartment has 4 structures. First one is extensor digitorum. Next to it is extensor indicis tendon, the posterior interosseous nerve and the anterior interosseous artery. The fifth compartment lies between radius and ulna and contains the tendon of extensor digiti minimi. The last compartment on the ulna is containing the tendon of extensor carpi ulnaris. The figure shows the radius laterally and the ulna medially. The interosseous membrane is attached to the medial border of radius and the lateral border of ulna. Interosseous membrane direction of fibers is downwards and medially. At right angles to the interosseous membrane, there is an oblique cord which goes from the radius to the ulna. This figure shows the transmission of weight from the wrist joint to the radius. From the radius it comes to the ulna along the interosseous membrane, and from the ulna it goes to the humerus, because ulna is taking more part in the formation of the elbow joint. This is a section of radius and ulna. The lateral surface of radius is big and the medial surface of ulna is big. Interosseous border is the medial border of radius and the lateral border of ulna, the anterior surface of both the bones and the posterior surface of both the bones. Anterior border of radius, posterior border of radius, and anterior and posterior border of ulna. The lateral surface of the radius is lateral and the medial surface, of course, of the ulna is medial. Here, during act of pronation, the radius turns over the ulna. Ulna remains almost fixed and the radius turns over and carries the hand with it, and this is the movement of the pronation. The lower end of radius articulates with the proximal row of carpal bones. The scaphoid is lateral and the lunate is medial, and ulna articulates with the triquetral bone. This shows the attachment of the muscles on the radius and ulna. The posteriorly on the radial tuberosity is insertion of biceps brachii. Lateral to it is a big insertion of supinator muscle. Below that is the insertion of pronator teres. Still below that is the insertion of the brachioradialis. On the anterior oblique line is the origin of flexor digitorum superficialis. Upper 3/4 is flexor pollicis longus, and lower 1/4 is the insertion of pronator quadratus muscle. Finishing the ulna side by side, the anterior surface of the coronoid process is the insertion of brachialis muscle, and there are few slips of the other muscles. Important muscle on the ulna is the flexor digitorum profundus, which also arises from the interosseous membrane, anterior surface as well as medial surface till the posterior border, and lower part is an oblique line for the origin of the pronator quadratus muscle. The posterior surface of radius also shows the insertion of the supinator, as well as on the radial tuberosity the insertion of biceps brachii. In addition, there are the muscles arising from the posterior border, abductor and posterior border and posterior surface. Abductor pollicis longus arises from both the radius and the ulna. Extensor pollicis brevis only from the radius and interosseous membrane, whereas extensor pollicis longus from only the ulna and the interosseous membrane, and extensor indicis also only from the posterior surface of ulna and the interosseous membrane. And here the huge origin of flexor digitorum profundus, flexor is arising from the medial surface of ulna, and on the lateral surface of the olecranon process and on the shaft is the origin of a weak muscle, the anconeus, and the most important muscle is on the superior surface of the olecranon process of ulna, which is the triceps brachii. The origin of supinator is below the radial notch of ulna, from the ulna, and it embraces the whole of radius on the posterior surface, lateral surface, and to the anterior surface, so that the act of supination can be done efficiently. Shows the back of humerus to show the origin of the lateral head of triceps brachii from a small area, and most of the posterior surface gives attachment to the huge medial head of triceps brachii, whereas the long head arises only from the infraglenoid tubercle. All these three heads join to get inserted into the olecranon process of the ulna. This is the important extensor of the elbow joint. Shows from the radius, anterior surface of radius, the flexor pollicis longus muscle arises, passes under the flexor retinaculum to go to the distal phalanx, base of the distal phalanx of the thumb. And the huge muscle, the flexor digitorum profundus, arises, passes again under the flexor retinaculum, divides into 4 tendons, and they pass straight to the base of the distal phalanx of the index finger, middle finger, ring finger, and the little finger. In this, it shows the attachments of the important muscle, the pronator quadratus, which is arising by a ridge from the lower part of the ulna and goes and gets inserted into the anterior surface of the radius at its lower end, and also onto the medial surface